Welcome to Techs on Techs. This is Jed Sunwall. We are back this month with Keith Garrett to talk about The Truth of Fact, The Truth of Feeling by Ted Chiang. I'm just going to say it right now. I love Keith. He's fantastic. I'm so glad I had him on the podcast. He's a little bit coy when he introduces himself and says, who isn't a technologist these days? But I'll say what he wouldn't say, which is that he's a very capable and experienced technologist. I think one of the deeper thinkers I know, and certainly one of the most experienced people I know in thinking really hard about high impact decision environments that rely on data. Just an awesome guy, and clearly a deep thinker. I'm so glad to know him, and I'm so glad that he agreed to come on the podcast to talk about this story. I will warn him and you all in advance that he will be back on the podcast, because as I edited this episode, I realized he did a good job of getting me to talk a bunch, and I did not ask him all the questions I wanted to ask him. And I'm left thinking, okay, I got to have him back on to ask a bunch of questions of my own of him. So more to come, but for now, enjoy the conversation. See you on the other side. Welcome, Keith, to Techs on Techs.
Great to be here.
Yeah. Shout out to AI2, the Allen Institute for Artificial Intelligence, for letting us use their office today, and thanks for coming out. So Keith, I want you to introduce yourself, but I'm going to force you to answer the question whether or not you consider yourself a technologist.
Is there anyone in our generation who isn't a technologist these days? I mean, as somebody who observes and uses technology, it's everywhere, right? Yeah. But I mean, more in the sense of observe and use, and sometimes try to think about the applications and how it applies to what it is I'm trying to get done. Absolutely. But yeah. I'm much more on the why and the what and less on the how. I can do various things with technology, but I don't spend all my time with a code or with a wrench trying to build something.
Right. Well, and also the story we're talking about today overtly makes the case that the fact that we're using language to speak to one another means that
language is a technology.
Yeah,
right. Yeah.
Do you want to say anything else about what you do, or you've had an interesting career, but I'll let you tell it yourself.
Well, I don't want to go too much into any of it, but I'm an independent advisor for the use of data in development policy. I'm a former Marine, and also, because it's relevant to the story, a father who has some thoughts about integrating technology into the lives of my family and my children.
Yeah. Oh, great. Okay. That's okay. Let's go.
Let's do it.
Yeah, but I chose this. So I knew you were a Ted Chiang fan. I'm a Ted Chiang fan. We know that he's somewhere not too far from us here in this greater Seattle area, we think. Since I started the idea for the podcast, I've been looking forward to this day. And so but I chose this story. I was pretty sure you'd read it and knew that you'd appreciate it. This was actually, I don't remember if it was maybe one of the first readings I gave my students last semester.
Oh yeah.
At Yale. Yeah.
How'd they like it?
I mean, fine. I gave them a lot of weird stuff to read. And so and also it's my first time teaching. So I was just like, did you read the story? Did you like it? And then I just kind of referred to it throughout the lecture that day. But
was there clear which students had actually read it and which ones had pretended to read it?
I have some guesses, but because they've got a lot of reading to do.
Yeah.
And we were talking before, Chiang is difficult. And I was rereading the story again for at least the third time, preparing for this, realizing, it's going to be hard to talk about him because every sentence matters.
Yeah,
it's so precise.
Yeah.
And so, and as I was reading it again, this just over the past few days, thinking it almost contains the entire class that I taught, all the stuff that I wanted to talk about, all the themes were covered.
And you did a good job selecting the story for your class.
Yeah.
And that's, you could have named it after him. You could have named the class after him.
That's true. Ted Chiang's Planetary Scale Data Institutions with Jed Sunwall. Okay. But anyway, let's get into it. Do you want to give a summary? I want to hear your summary of the story.
I want to hear your summary of the story too, but it's essentially two stories told side by side. One written by the person in the other's part of the story. So there's an unnamed narrator who is a journalist and is assigned a story to evaluate a new technology called REMEM. And that narrator takes you through their own sort of thought process and evolution around technology, its application to a problem like raising a child, and also how it relates to both his job and cognition and thinking and working, and most importantly, revisiting his own understanding of his life narrative, and or her life narrative. It was his.
It's his.
It's definitely his.
Yeah.
Sorry. And comes to a conclusion that the best way to do this, rather than writing some pro and con journalism article, is to tell another story that evaluates the introduction of a new cognitively effective technology on a different society. Wow. The choices that the society is making, the individuals are making when they make use of that technology, and how it affects them.
Yeah.
And it does so in a pretty profound way.
Oh yeah. I mean, actually, it's interesting. You pause there. You're talking about the introduction of a cognitively, and then you said affecting technology. Whereas if I were to complete that sentence, an easy way to complete would be to say enhancing, but that's too normative.
Yeah, it's totally normative, right? Like,
Yeah.
it's easy to confuse new with improved, right? Like, just because it's doing something to you doesn't necessarily mean that it's better.
Yeah.
Right.
So I'll summarize the story again. I'll go into a little bit more detail and spoil everything, because that's what I do. That's what the podcast is about.
I wasn't sure how much in the way of spoilers you wanted me to put.
It's an all spoiler podcast.
Okay. Got it. If you haven't read the story, hang up now. Turn it off now.
Yeah, hang up.
Hang up on that thing we still call a phone, even though it's actually a supercomputer. Right.
Yeah. So, and also, like, this is one it'll be in the show notes, and I think I've shared already that we'll be talking about this. People have time to read ahead if they're subscribing, like and subscribe, or whatever you do, if you haven't already. But then there's a free version of this online. Like, it's
oh, really?
He published it on some like online magazine, and that's in the web archive. So it's accessible to people. This is another moment where, like I did with Borges, where I'm like, everyone should own these books. Like, I do think owning Borges' collected fictions is
they're great.
Up there, like with the having a Bible or whatever people think they should have in their house. Ted Chiang's collections, both of them, I think are up there. And I haven't read all of his stories. Like, I've had the collections for years, but I've never gone through like the whole book cover to cover.
Huh.
I'll get there, but it's just kind of like I dip in every now and then.
I wasn't passing judgment or anything.
Okay. Yeah. That's just fine. I'll get around to it.
No, it's understandable, right? Like, you can read a very short story from Ted Chiang and be left without the need to read anything for like a week.
Yeah.
Because you'll be sitting there pondering it.
And for years. I mean, yeah.
And so like, I totally understand not getting through cover to cover.
Yeah. The story at hand. So the author is this journalist, and he writes a story of him confronting REMEM. So first of all, REMEM is a technology that it's sort of like the next cool thing adding on to this idea of a life log. Like, it's already assumed that we're in a future, or we're living in some timeline where people have like retinal cameras that like are recording their life. And so people have life logs that they can consult. But previously it was kind of hard to find them. And so REMEM is some sort of like indexing or search engine function that allows you to, and this is another cool thing, sub-vocalize. So there's like sort of a new human interface of the technology, which is, he talks about sub-vocalization, which is you make it's almost as if you like hummed the words. I've heard like this is what people with like what's the tracheotomy? Like those like, it's like,
I hadn't thought of it that way.
Yeah. So like you're all you're doing is you're just using your vocal cords. You're moving your vocal cords to make the sounds, but you're not actually like pushing air through your vocal cords.
Does that even work though? Don't you also use your like the amount of air you're moving past and your tongue and your lips and all the rest of that to make words?
They're part of it for sure. I mean, there's a bunch of inflection in what I just said, but I think if you were just, I think there are ways to, it seems plausible to me that you could send a signal to a computer that it would recognize as words just with those shapes. Maybe
Yeah.
not all words.
I mean,
It might not know if you're asking a question or not, or
well,
like there's
probably
tone
some
that-
sort of, some sort of well-trained learner that knew what the probability of what you were trying to say is in context with.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that's why those like tracheotomy. Anyway, those I just call them a trach. Like those things that vibrate. It's a vibration that's external to you. It's prosthetic that is able to pick up on your vocal cord shapes and make word sounds.
Huh. I had no idea how
It's
those
a
things
thing.
work.
So leave a comment if I'm totally off base about this. I'm sure there's a lot more going on here, but that's what's happening. And so, but anyway, so REMEM is this technology that somehow
it's Google search for your life.
Yeah, and it's totally integrated with your body. So you're able to say like pull up the memory, pull up my 40th birthday or whatever, and it's like here you go, and you can see it. So it's this prosthetic memory, and he's like, I'm not so sure about this because the video, like my memories are imbued with emotions and other contexts that make me who I am, and just having like a plain video, a sensor that is just sort of like recorded something, it's not capturing everything that like it means, like my life history means to be me. So he's resistant to it. Then in parallel, the story of the Tiv people and Jijinji is a story of an African tribe that does not have a written language, and a European missionary comes and introduces the written language to them. There's also skepticism there, and it's just the story of that being like incorporated into their culture and the impact that it has there.
Yeah.
So
not remember
just written language. Written language itself.
The ability to write language down.
Yeah. And so the conceit of the story is that it's this journalist who's telling his own story, and he's telling the story of the Tiv people to make his point. But the way it ends,
a variation on what is supposedly a true story.
That's right. Yeah. So he's like, this is not necessarily, it's based on some records, but yeah, it's kind of like a dramatization, which is a whole other element to the story that's interesting. But to skip ahead to what, like sort of a final spoiler, it ends with him. It starts with him being skeptical of REMEM and ends with him saying, you know what, I'm going to embrace this.
Right.
And it's going to make me better. But the story of the Tiv people is one in which Jijinji really, gets into the written language, adopts it, and then ultimately decides to not use it and even burn his journals that he's written. And I'll just leave it at that. So that's it's an interesting story.
You don't want to give the ultimate spoiler though.
Tell me the ultimate spoiler.
That when he finally gets confronted with other people's life logs of his own actions.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. So that's the big twist. Why don't you tell the story? Yeah.
Well, you're a much better storyteller than I am.
No.
Just that he gets to a point where, in investigating the technology, he realizes he doesn't have enough of a life log to actually work with, and so he polls his friends who do, friends and family who do have a life log to work with, and he searches through their interactions with him, so he can see what their experience of interacting with him. And he has this moment in his personal narrative, the internal narrative in his head, which he remembers very clearly in one way, somebody being cruel to him.
Yeah.
But his daughter, in fact, being cruel to him. But when he sees it in the life log, it's clear that he was the one who was cruel to her.
Yeah.
And he had drawn the completely different life narrative from that point.
Yeah.
On the basis of his own, sort of his feelings around that particular episode.
Yeah.
Right. And he might have walked away with the understanding that he needed to do better. I mean, he walked away with a lesson that he needed to be a better parent, a better father.
Yeah.
But the specific details of it, of how terrible his behavior had been, were lost on him.
Yeah. It's amazing. And I think we should definitely talk about fatherhood, but then also colonialism which again, this story is a jumping off point to
a lot of different topics.
A lot of different topics, but this is two pretty clear ones. I mean,
but it's also amazing. That's another quality of Ted Chiang's writings, right? Like it's 20, 35 pages, maybe 40 pages, and it's got so much that you can work with in there. I mean,
it's really good.
It's amazing.
Thanks, Ted. I should make sure he listens to this. Okay, so like a thing to remember is that, so he's writing this story as a journalist at this point in time, at which point he has crafted an image of himself and a story of himself that goes back at something like 13 or 15 years. I don't remember exactly, but like since that moment when he was very cruel to his daughter. And since then has managed to maintain an actual relationship with her, and they were able to get past that and have a pretty decent relationship. And he finds himself, at time zero as he's writing, just thinking like, yeah, that thing happened in the past, and over the intervening years, like things got better because of all these things that I did.
Mm-hmm. Right. Right.
Which is the story that his mind fabricated for himself to survive, or whatever, to believe himself to be a good person. And this research I came across years ago, sometime in the past few years, that was kind of like a compendium of biases and just sort of like, what are the core biases that influence everybody's beliefs? And like the main, like number one bias is like, I am a good person. Like we're just like hardwired to believe that we're good. And
are you saying I'm not?
You might think you are. And we have to, like, it's just kind of like a way that we survive. And so anyway, what's interesting about his story is not just that like he misremembered the moment of cruelty of him telling his daughter to just leave. And him, first of all, flipping that, so it was her telling him to leave. Misremembering that, but also misremembering the intervening years, which is he's like, I worked really hard to become a better father, and now we're friends. Where it's like, no, she went to therapy. Like that's how it worked.
Well, both could be true. Both are true, right? Like, I mean, so much of it is about the fundamental nature of our perspective, the limits of our perspective.
Right.
She's not aware of the work he did. He's not aware of the work she did.
That's right. She never told him that
their interactions are the sum of those of that work and their ability to apply it to the circumstance.
That's right.
He might be the more guilty party, but it doesn't mean he didn't do what he felt was work relative to improving their relationship.
You're right. It's not a binary, but it reveals kind of the point here of the narrator's inherent bias is that they can only see so much.
Well, and he goes into this in the story with the Tiv, where he's talking about what's precise versus what's right? The two local language words for precision versus correctness or what's right.
Yeah. Which was okay. So this is actually, forget it. We're skip fatherhood for a second. We talk about colonialism, because so there's Jijinji, this young man. He ends up becoming a scribe at these sort of like court proceedings that they have among the tribes. And the missionary is curious about these proceedings and asks about like how they work. And the way it works is you have I guess there's kind of like a plaintiff and a defendant or something like that, or an accuser and the accused. They are not sworn in,
right? And
then there's a witness who is sworn in to tell what actually happened,
right?
And so, remind me, what are the terms?
I don't remember.
Okay, so there are terms, but there are these two terms for.
It's like Vogue and.
That's right.
Something else.
You don't remember the Tiv language?
I'm sorry.
Yeah. So there's these two terms. It's Mimi, I think. There's like, anyway, Mimi and Vogue or something like that. Where Mimi is like, what is right? Yeah. I'm going to tell the story from my perspective based on what I think is right. And then there's Vogue, which is like, here's what actually happened. And so they're able to hold these two concepts of correctness, I would say. I won't use the word truth, but I guess it's in the title, the truth of fact and the truth of feeling. Mimi is the truth of feeling. Vogue is the truth of fact. And the European missionary is like, you can't do that. Like, the truth is the most important thing. And they're like, well, there are many different truths.
Well, but also then the missionary immediately follows that up with, because we focus on the truth, the real truth, the accurate thing that happened. That's why Europeans are here. And, that's why we come to be so rich. And Gigi and Guy is like, how do you know? Like, how does he actually know that that's the truth, right? Like
That's right.
he's doing what he feels is right. He's saying what he feels is right, even and claiming to have the truth.
Oh, wow. Yeah, this is very good insight.
It's not like, and it's not obvious to the missionary, right? The missionary is just telling what he says, like from his perspective, because he's only been ever told to be talking about things in terms of what is what is right, what is correct, or what is accurate.
Right.
That he doesn't have this other concept of what is right to him may not be accurate to other people.
Right. So yeah, it's revealing that he does not have a word for this in his language. He has one concept of the truth. But then,
which I think is like sort of central point of the whole story. There's just truth in fact, and there's truth in feeling.
Yeah. And so what you're saying is that the European missionary, who I just read this, I don't remember his name. Mosby, that's right. Mosby, he feels that Europeans are better, or that his way of life is better, and has really no way of articulating why that's actually true.
Well, because he's a missionary, that God has rewarded Europeans for walking the true path and doing what they've done.
Right.
And to himself, he doesn't say it to the missionary, but Gigi Inges says, well, how do they know? That's right. That's why they ended up where
we don't know how they really got their power or whatever. That's where it came from. But then there's also like, so there's the story makes reference to, again, in this court proceeding, this some concern around like a dowry being paid appropriately or being paid back, and the fact that like new European customs are being introduced that allow money to be exchanged for a wife.
Yeah.
And the concept of money as an abstraction, as a store of value, is another new concept that's been introduced that's eroding the old ways of doing things. And they don't like that either. But the point being that like Mosby's showing up being like, this is the way that things should be. And the Tiv are like, we're just not necessarily on board with everything. Doesn't feel right to us. So that they're skeptical and resistant and otherwise just not easily convinced that like this is a better way or the right way to live.
Yeah, well, sort of. I mean, one of the things, I think one of the moral of the story and the Tiv sub story in this is that the act of being, or the act of writing, the result of being taught how to write changed Gigi Inge's thinking. It changed the way he thought. And so the way in which he wanted to solve a particular problem did not align with the way his elders wanted to solve the problem.
Right.
Because their cognition was about what's good for us now.
Right.
As opposed to what's accurate according to some written piece of paper 40 years ago.
That's right.
And makes the interesting point that the people who made that record 50 years ago may not agree with that record being used in that particular way.
Right. And there's also no way of corroborating whether or not they were lying when they made that record in the first place. Or maybe lying isn't the right word, but that they were using the record that was documented 50 years ago was made based on an assessment of reality that benefited them at that time, but might not have been factually accurate.
Right.
Right.
But I mean, I think that the central element of it is that our sub-story's main character, Gigi and Guy, is not, his own thinking has been changed by adopting this technology that the people around him don't have or use.
That's right.
Right?
Yeah.
And he realizes that it affects him and it alienates him in a way that maybe he doesn't want to maintain.
Yeah.
Or keep.
Yeah.
Right.
No, there are these great stories of him being made fun of by his peers. Well, he tried to like write down a sermon or a talk or something like that, and they're like, "This is terrible.
This is terrible. What's wrong with your memory that you need to write this down?"
Right? Yeah, and then making fun of him. They're like, "Are you going to remember this? Do you need to write something down so you can remember it?"
Yeah.
There's a story from somewhere in Aristotle's writings about an Egyptian king. I'll pull this up. I'll put it in the show notes somewhere. But like, it's a story of somebody going to this Egyptian king and being like, we have this amazing technology, which is called writing. It's a story. It's like, I'm certain Chiang is familiar with it, but it's like the king is presented with the new technology, which is the written language, as this amazing thing because it'll allow us to record information and have it over the long term. And the king is like, you idiot. Like, all this is going to do is make it so that you don't use your own memory, and it'll make you more forgetful because you won't have to use your memory and exercise it.
Yeah.
Yeah. But again, I think if there's one thing that I think this story is consistent about all the way through, is that the human memory is not a reliable record of factual information.
How could it be? I mean, like, you think about how much we would have to store, like the being able to forget things that aren't relevant to you moving through space or moving objects around, or, obtaining food or whatever it is your brain is trying to figure out how to do in a given moment. Like, if it had to remember everything, every sensory input, like, your head would be, so large as to be impractical for doing any movement.
Yeah.
And not only that, but I seem to remember there's these people out there that have this, like, I'm trying to remember the name of the diagnosis is something like super autobiographical memory.
Yeah.
Something like that. Who basically can remember, for all intents and purposes, most of their lives since puberty. There's like 20 of them in the world, right?
Yeah.
And they actually, like, if you ask them, like, what would happen on a Thursday 25 years ago, on Thursday, April 15th, 25 years ago, they'd go, oh yeah, I was walking to the store and this guy, like, came out of the store and he was wearing this red jacket that was terrible. Right. And for the most part, they're very, like, they're very high functioning people, but, like, there's examples of these people who have, like, memories of things they don't want to remember, and they can't not remember it.
Yeah. Well,
so like there's a certain purpose, I think, in being able to forget.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. Yeah.
Like, there's a reason we evolved this way. It provides some sort of advantage that the alternative may not offer.
For sure. I mean, if you think about us, like, evolving to be fit to reproduce and whatever, and, like, just move through the world and survive, like, hoarding tons of information doesn't make sense, or whatever. You can see why it's not necessarily valuable. Like, and also, I don't pretend to understand how information is encoded in the brain, but, like, there's got to be some storage limit. I would think, but
maybe it's, I don't know. Maybe it's actually way cooler than we think it is, and there is no upper limit because of how it works, right?
It could be that there's practically no limit. Like, this is very.
My question is the difference between limit and utility, right? Like,
right. Well, actually, so Nathaniel Raymond, Natty Raymond, was on this podcast before. So he does like use the satellite imagery to do, like, humanitarian research, right? And focus specifically on like genocide and like just really catastrophic, calamitous things. But he has this great line, which is that new ways of seeing create new ways of being blind. And the idea being that, like, we have to focus on certain things to just sort of, like, get through life. And so we do shed a lot of information, or otherwise ignore lots of information. I'm not paying attention to the colors of the cars passing by as we're talking right now.
Right.
There's just, we have to focus as nodes moving through this world on certain things. And yeah, that's, I guess, so I guess what you're saying, though, and I agree with, is that it sort of makes sense that forgetting is a feature, not a bug, of our memory.
I think so.
Yeah.
I mean, if you've ever had a romantic partner and, like, needed to forget something, like being a little bit forgetful or being a little bit deaf is sometimes useful to maintaining a relationship.
Yeah.
Right? I like, my wife is incredibly forgiving of me. Like, that's, I think there's probably plenty of examples of where being forgetful was actually helpful.
Yeah. Well, that's another interesting part of the story, though, right? Because so he has misremembered. So back to the narrator, he's misremembered this episode with his daughter. She has not, because the way he found out about it is that it was her recording of that moment,
right,
of it happening. So she had never forgotten it.
Well, but she also hadn't revisited that moment. She hadn't been sitting there going over the life log.
Do we know
knew it.
that?
She knew it because it was a pivotal moment in her life. Like
Right.
it was a flashbulb memory for her that was like, this is so emotionally damaging and traumatizing that, she leaves the house and says, this man is horrible.
Yeah.
She remembers that, and her life pivots on that point, just like his does.
Yeah.
But she had the accurate version of it.
She had the accurate, but there's no, we don't have any evidence in the story of her. Maybe she did look at it a lot. Maybe she did go back and revisit.
Well, he does say that though, that she goes back and she realizes she made a similar kind of mistake to his mistake, but in other circumstances where she had misremembered something.
Yeah.
She had not been bothering to search her life log. She had it, but had not been bothering to go through it.
Got it. Okay.
And then as part of their, coming together.
Yeah.
After the story was to revisit some moments of her own and realize that she had made similar errors and was a little more forgiving for him because of that.
Yeah. Yeah. And then, I mean, and this is to drive the point home about him ultimately just being like, you know what, I'm on board, like with Ramem. This is going to make me a better person. And he also says, he's like, I'm opening up my life logs. You can tell me, like, to the reader, whether or not it's true. What are you going to say?
How did you react to that? How did you find that as an answer? As a completion of the story?
Well, so first of all, like, he's just sort of agreed to let the technology change him. But because he's on board with this idea that, like, he will be better if he has an unvarnished view of who he is, and he's accountable to that accurate recording. And this is a very interesting philosophical question around data gathering and privacy.
Yeah.
Because people are like, well, if you're not guilty, who cares if they're tracking you all the time? I'm like, well, I'm not guilty now, but like, maybe it'll become illegal to be the way that I am.
Have you ever read A Gentleman in Moscow?
I have. Yeah, let's talk about that.
That's central. I mean, like that's essentially what it is, right? Like he's, the revolution and the victory of the Bolsheviks essentially makes him guilty for who he is, and the story kicks off from that point.
That's right. Yeah,
he can't change who he was. He can't change who he is. He's an unforgivable or unreformable aristocrat.
Yeah, yeah. Right. He's like, I can't help but know a lot about wine and care about it,
So anyway, going back to the story. I mean, going back to the truth of fact or the truth of feeling. It's in that ending, he's accepting that this technology improves him, or at least it helped him discover some tremendous gap about himself, and so he just he says, okay, I'm going to do it. And he goes one step further. He's like, I'm not even just going to use it for myself. I'm going to give it to anybody who wants to check me, because I now need to be checked.
I need to be policed.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think my gut reaction is like, I don't like that. Like, I don't like that idea. I do journal religiously.
Oh yeah.
And in fact, we're going to go to Sayulita for spring break. Have you ever been down there? It's north of Puerto Vallarta in Mexico. It's awesome.
I can't say that I have.
We went like 3 years ago, and my wife and I were talking about, like, the town is quite small, and so you rent golf carts and you drive golf carts around the town. It's amazing. Don't go to Sayulita. It's too crowded. But I was like, no, we rented a golf cart for multiple days, and she's like, no, we only got it this one day. Anyway, there's, a debate about whatever had happened. And I'm like, I can go back to my journal and look. Like, I'm pretty sure I'll have this written down. I haven't gone back and looked, but like, we have records of like everything. And, but I also feel quite strongly that, like,
would you put them on the internet?
So they are on the internet. They're behind a password.
Right. Would you get rid of the password, or?
So I've thought about this. Yeah, for sure. Like when I die, like, can I just open them up for everybody? But if I do that, I also feel like if my kids spent any time going back and looking at it, I would be somewhat disappointed in them, because I'd be like, you should have better things to do. Like, you can maybe be idly curious, but like, there's just a lot of nonsense in there. I do it more for me to practice writing, I think, than anything else. It's just sort of like a ritual at this point. But I certainly don't want this to go into
So then why not burn it at the end of the day? Why not delete them when you're done writing them? Or delete them after 90 days or 60
something
days.
like that.
Yeah.
Well, no, it is fun to have the record to go back to.
So that you can win arguments with your wife?
So you can win arguments. Absolutely. Yeah. Like that's
I bet she loves that.
Priceless. No, like just, actually what's funny and interesting with one of the more like practically useful things about it is that I can go back in old journal entries and read about me being stressed. It's always like, oh, I'm so stressed about like work, because I'm just cranking these things out. And like, it's an embarrassing proportion of journal entries are just me talking about being stressed out about stuff. And I'll go back to read something from like, 2018. And I'm like, I have no idea what I was stressed about. Like, I'm like, I don't have any real recollection of like what the actual urgency was or anything like that.
See, that's another example of when it's useful to forget.
Exactly. Yeah. But, but like my takeaway is like, I should forget about being stressed right now. Yeah. Because it doesn't matter. Like it's kind of good to have the
I've been stressed before and I'm not, it didn't get me anywhere.
Exactly.
So
yeah.
I'm not worried about it.
So anyway, so it's it's a mysterious thing to me, like actually why I do it.
So that's you applying an analog technology to something akin to this story.
Yeah.
Let's say your own kids, do you encourage them to journal? If life logging was a thing, would you encourage them to do that?
No, this is my policy on a lot of stuff like this. Is sort of like, I do it. It works for me. I'm happy to help other people do it, but it's a personal decision whether or not they want to do it.
Yeah. So I think there's a lot to agree with in there. I guess the thing that I was thinking about in the context of the story, whether comparing the idea of life logging and writing, is that like writing at a certain point through public education and other things became ubiquitous.
Right.
You couldn't operate in society without adopting that technology.
That's right.
And you think about the internet and our cell phones now, it's the same sort of thing. Like try to get done half of the things that you need to get done when interacting with businesses or the government or other people without using the internet. Like just calling, showing up somewhere, mailing a letter, like people will start to hate you.
For sure. Yeah.
It's going to take a lot longer to get done most of the things that you need to get done. So your productivity is going to go down.
Yeah.
So you kind of don't have a choice but to participate.
That's right.
Right. But a lot of people who participate don't set any boundaries on it. And I think one of the morals of that story with the TIFF was that there should be boundaries on that technology, on that. Even the act of writing should have boundaries around when it's applied to things like dispute settlement or future decisions. Like the writing should only take us so far, can only take us so far. We should remember that it can only take us so far, therefore we should only let it take us so far. As opposed to what I think the writer concedes to at the end of the story, which is that, well, I'm a terrible person and this helped me figure that out. So, I should just surrender to it completely. And and not set any boundaries around it and not say that there's a limit to where this is useful or appropriate.
Right.
And that didn't sit well with me.
Well, so this
is one of those things where like you can love a story and be like, God, I don't love that ending.
Yeah. Like, no, and I think again, I mean,
it was a very useful ending because it was actually very human. I mean, like that's what people tend to do, right? People tend to default to these. At least my experience is that people tend to default to it's hard or it's easy, so I'm just going to go to the easy one. It's black or it's white, so I'm going to pick one or the other.
Right.
But like walking a nuanced line, that gray line, that balance between two extremes involves work and involves effort, and you have to sustain it over a period of time.
Yeah.
And a lot of people don't want to do that. And so they end up turning themselves over completely to a technology that can have very profound effects on how they think and how they operate.
Yeah. But it does seem to be clearly this narrator is not an unthinking person, but it's also clear. It does feel like a capitulation.
Yeah, totally.
And I don't think, and Chiang is good about this. He's the narrator, the protagonist more or less of the story, but like it's not clear that like he made the right choice at the end,
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And so I think there's a key to understanding this in the story, which is so you referred to before Jijinji, or however we say his name.
Who knows?
Who knows? I don't speak Tiv.
I don't either.
There's a dispute around so first of all, the Europeans, the colonialists, are further like administrating and chopping up their land into different like administrative subsections and stuff like this. And so they've got to make decisions on what tribes they align with because they're going to start drawing boundaries around them and things like that. So and there's a whole other concept of Europeans and mapping technology, which is something that you and I work a lot on. That's like
Right.
starting to shape the world and shape how these societies function.
Right.
And so there's a dispute around which tribes they should align with based on resources and alliances and stuff like that. And I'm just further spoiling the story. Jijinji goes and gets an official record that indicates that based on their like lineage, based on like their actual lineage, their tribe should align with another tribe that his tribe leader does not want to align with because it's not going to be beneficial to them. Basically pointing out that, as we've discussed, like this written language has a version of the truth that might be factual, but it doesn't feel right because it's not going to benefit their people. And so Jijinji shows this to the chief or whatever, the leader of the tribe. He's like, hey, look, like what you're saying isn't factually true. Like this is not our lineage. Our actual lineage means we should align with this other tribe. And his tribe leader says, he's like, you've gotten so into this writing. Have you forgotten what it means to be Tiv? And like, that's the line, which is sort of like, yeah, that's great that you have this technology, but like it means something to be this kind of person and you are losing that in this moment. The narrator and a lot of us Westerners, I have abandoned, I would say, a very robust understanding of like what it means to be human or like those principles that you're talking about. Like, you're like, oh yeah, we should resist the Borg, or maybe we should resist this technology that's just sort of steamrolling everything, like the internet and apps and phones, and adopting this as the way that we live. But it's like, well, on what basis? Like, what is it that we're trying to get back to? And and there's tons of movements of people being like, I am like paleo or off the grid, or like trying to draw some sort of line where it's like, we got to go back to, I mean, MAGA's part of this as well. Like there's always this kind of, I'm not saying that this is necessarily politically charged, but the point being that like, there's always a vague concept of like, there's a time before now when things were the way they were supposed to be. And I don't know. I don't have no articulation of what that is, but
there's people who would argue to say that like technology has always affected human beings. That like from going, I think Mustafa Suleiman makes this point in one of his recent books. The fire changes our anatomy. That like because we can essentially pre-digest food with a fire. Right. Our brains can get larger and our guts can get smaller. Right. And and like if you compare the evolutionary history, you can kind of see where fire comes into the set because technology has changed our anatomy. And that kind of, there are examples of that kind of thing through to today. I'm trying to remember, I think it's Eleanor Macbeth or somebody did some research on London cabbies that like they have to memorize the knowledge, right, of like how to get around London, right, without a GPS device. They had to memorize all these little like side streets and all the rest of this. And they're a physical part of their brain gets larger as a result of having to store all that.
Oh, so that's what the memory storage is,
right? Like it's more like that's the piece that does the storage, right? Like, and it's the same thing you were saying too. I think very early on when talking about the Egyptian parable. You using this tool means you're going to forget how to do it, right? Like that London cabbie example is like a perfect example of like how our anatomy changes in response to our environment, right? These people use their sense of physical orientation in space and spatial relationships to get around. They build a stronger part of that brain. People who aren't doing that and rely on the GPS are probably also losing that same part of that anatomy, right? And there's probably a trade-off there, right? And so I the kind of the place that goes, if you want to go down that road a little bit, you could sit there and argue, well, like maybe we just need a more nuanced approach to technology that evaluates its effect on us over time, rather than saying it's automatically good or automatically bad, right? Like you might be solving for some fairly innocuous problem, but having a huge trade-off, and we see plenty of examples like that, where there's like, we're fixing a problem, but there's some really big consequences. And we aren't really clear on what those consequences are until 5, 10, 15 years after the fact, whether we're talking about leaded gasoline or social media, right? Like, it all seemed like a great solution at the time, but then
Right.
like we get down the road and we're going, well, okay, maybe this isn't exactly the panacea that we thought it was, or maybe this isn't as innocuous as we thought it was.
Yeah.
To this day, I mean, 100 years later, we're still trying to take lead pipes out of buildings.
Right.
But lead pipes solved a particular type of problem at a certain point in our history.
For sure. You use sanitation, you get toilets. I mean, it has a huge impact on.
So,
Yeah.
when I think there's probably an argument somewhere in there for saying that a less black and white and more mature approach than is adopted by either of the two main characters in the story, um, of going one way or the other, saying absolute adoption versus absolute rejection.
Right.
As to say, like, well, maybe we need a moment where we say, okay, we're going to be open to this and we're going to give it a try, but we're going to be mindful of what there are negative consequences, and we're going to reevaluate that decision every 3 or 5 years or whatever it is.
Yeah.
I don't think we need to be quite so black and white about the adoption of technology, but I don't know.
Well, you're
interested
right.
in what you think.
Well, I'm not saying, yeah, it's like, I wouldn't argue that like everyone's supposed to be like the Tiv, like that's one way of being, and you can choose to be that way. And I think Jijinji ultimately chose, he's like, this is who I am and who I want to be. And that's one way to live. I think I have this one benefit that I've had in my life is that I grew up in a religion, then I left that religion. And so, with not like a ton of animosity or anything like that, it just what ultimately wasn't for me. But having lived through that has given me lived experience of being like, this is a way to live. Like, this is the way that you're supposed to live. And then not living that way and being like, oh, you can live. There are lots of different ways you can live. There are a lot of different ways to be and see the world. And it's fine. And my thinking is, so there's a line, I think it's towards the end. I mean, Chiang says, explicitly, he's like, technology is a language. If you use language to communicate, your engagement with the world is mediated by a technology right off the bat. And then like, it's towards the end of the story, he's like, if you use language, like the moment we started using language, we became a form of cyborg, in the sense that like we are using a technology to mediate our relationship with the world. And we do it through words that have, externally been decided to be codes to represent things like trees and cars and microphones, whatever it is. And so if you look at technology as language as a technology, like that fundamental level, I think a useful and, if not useful, at least interesting exercise is to just try to see the water that we're swimming in and understand that like everything we do is mediated by technology. And like, yeah, the new technologies are going to keep coming. And it's just layer upon layer of already, of the reality that we already live in, which is a world that is mediated by, again, without even having a definition of what technology is, but like external things that we use to kind of make sense out of the world and move through it and manipulate it. Does that make sense?
Totally. Yeah. I wonder what you think in terms of, okay, so you put a lot on the table there. There's there's leaving a religion and having that change your perspective on things, and then getting to a place where technology will help you do a particular set of things, but then you might lose track of the sort of water you're swimming in, as you were saying.
Yeah.
Are you comparing religion to a technology?
Oh, for sure. I mean, I would. That's not what I was saying, but like, yeah, for sure. I mean, I love religion. I love thinking about religion and studying religions because I see them as being experiments in governance and experiments in organizing humans. I mean, this is I've talked about my Mormon upbringing on other episodes of the podcast, but I was raised Mormon, and one of the things that sort of shocked me a little bit out of the religion was I was super interested in Scientology. I would always just read anything about Scientology because I was like, these people are so weird, and I'm like, I keep reading about Scientologists, and then after a while I was like, oh, wait a minute, like these are very similar stories to the story of Mormonism, I just like, it became clear to me, I was like, I have no right to be like mocking these people for having a a weird religion, because we have similar, just charismatic leader who writes stories, and also to show the dynamics of how the religion works. But I bring this up because even Scientologists explicitly talk about their religion as tech, as like technology.
Do they really?
Yeah, they do. Yeah. So they use the term tech as like their doctrine is is tech, and they talk about it. And I'm a little bit rusty on this, and the Scientologists can come after me if they want. But like of being very instrumental. Like if you have this tech, if you have this doctrine or this understanding, your life will improve in these ways. Very similar to how like a technology is sold, or like a new device or a new mechanism or something like that.
So I mean, thinking about that is kind of like like going back to the story here, right? Like,
sure.
Like our narrator has a moment where he realizes that like I've got this wrong. Right? There's a piece of information that's delivered that says I've got this wrong, and it goes down a different path.
Yeah.
Did you find that like that has like that you have experiences that resonate with you, or you go, oh wait a minute, maybe I've been thinking about this all wrong, and I really have to like reevaluate.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the cool parts of the story is that he encounters this video of him being the bad guy in the story, in which he previously thought he was the victim, and the cognitive dissonance is so strong that he's like, this must be manipulated video. Like there must there has to be a mistake here.
She definitely did something to mess with this.
Yeah,
she's playing a cruel trick on me.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, to the point like it's conspiratorial. Like, I think that I attribute having experienced cognitive dissonance and worked through it as being very valuable to me.
Right on.
Yeah, because like, you grow up thinking the world is a way, and being taught that the world is a way, and then at some point I had to actually acknowledge the possibility that it wasn't, and think through the implications of that. And a lot of people, they reach that point, they're like, this is dangerous. I can't go down this path. Intellectually, I can't think about it. And for whatever reason, I think I'm just naturally curious. And then also, shout out to my family, not like a super pious, dogmatic, it wasn't hard for me. I've never felt like an outcast because of, the way I've lived my life. Great. So it was easy for me in that way. For some people, the cognitive dissonance is so sharp because it's like, if I go down this path, like my wife will leave me, or my parents will tell me not to come home for the holidays. I don't, that's a little bit overblown. I know that happens in some families. I don't want to make it sound like that's what all Mormons do, because they don't. But it's obviously there are lots of religions throughout history that the world, it's like, if you leave, like, it's a death sentence, or you're an absolute pariah. So anyway, we're a bit, but yeah. So it is. I
mean, both of our characters go through something similar, right? Or they have to make a choice about whether or not they're going to adopt this technology, but also this change to the way in which they've been living their lives.
Yeah.
Up and until that point, on the basis of a realization that it has implications beyond themselves.
Right. Well, so I want to turn this to development economics, international development, and colonialism. I mean, because I think this is like,
it's a little bit of a hard pivot there.
Well, okay. No, I mean, I don't think it is, because it's like we're talking about missionary activity. We're talking about people coming into different parts of the world with technology that we promise will make things better for them, and they have to get on board or not. I think it's sort of like what you were saying before about like leaded pipes and things like that, is that I'm not saying that we should not, I'm not against international development. I've worked in it a lot through my career. I worked at USAID. Rest in peace. I don't think it's like completely dead, but still,
folded into State Department, I think is the current explanation.
It was sort of part of the State Department before, right? That's sort of unclear. But anyway, worked at the American Development Bank. Like, I'm a fan. But also, and this is not a controversial thing to say, is like, we don't know what's going to happen when we introduce these technologies, new technologies into new places. And like, I'm a big fan of the internet, giving people more internet access. There's no reason. The internet is such a powerful and broadly useful technology. It is absolutely an act of faith that we would go into low and middle income countries and be like, hey, you guys should have the internet. It'll be great. Like, all sorts of stuff can happen when people get access to the internet.
Right. And not all countries have adopted the internet.
Yeah.
Not all countries have at least adopted it in the way that we adopted it.
Yeah.
In the United States.
Well, and I think I've told this story.
Like a lot of countries have very different regulations around things like, free speech. I'm not making a normative statement about that, but they have implemented the technology itself in a particular way to align with what their local norms and values
That's right.
Around those.
The things. Germany and UK famously, arresting people over tweets and things like that, which is their prerogative. I've told this story before on this podcast. When I was at Amazon, I got brought into a human rights assessment. What is it called? Like human rights impact assessment or something like that for a new product. So this is the thing. It's an assessment you can do for any sort of like any new product you're developing to figure out like what are the human rights implications of it. There's like a process of going through this. And in theory, you're going to do an assessment of not just the supply chain. So like that's the main thing, which is sort of like if we start making this, like, is this going to what are the risks of like human rights risks, like forced labor in the supply chains for these products, or the countries where we're going to have to source stuff. And this is obviously a huge deal in technology with like rare earths that are typically mined in countries that are very poor and have poor controls. But you're also part of the assessment is you also think like, what are the implications of this technology? It's wild, that people try to do this. The punchline here is that I was no longer invited to these meetings because of what it was for Project Kuiper, which is the
satellite one,
satellite, the communication satellite thing. And I'm like, well, hey, like we're going to be giving internet through this to parts of the planet that have never been connected to the internet. Like, I think it's sort of interesting to think about human rights impact assessment when this is definitely going to change what it means to be human in those places. Just sort of like, have you forgotten what it means to be TIV? Like it will change it. And there's the New York Times had a story last year about remote tribes in the Amazon now having access to the internet. And, and there's this amazing quote. It's just sort of like, no one wants to make the beaded necklaces that we always make and like, go out hunting and this and that. Like the guys are looking at porn. Like it's all this sort of stuff you would expect.
Oh, wow.
And it's just this, but the quote is like, everything's changed and like no one wants to do the things they used to do. Also, please don't remove our internet.
Right. Right.
So, I think it just goes back to everything we were saying before is like these things. I think the phrase you used is really good. Intellectually affecting, or what did you say?
Cognitively affecting. I didn't want to be normative about it. I just wanted to say that it actually impacts your brain, right?
And therefore the brain of everyone around you.
Right. And so I'm not really on social media anymore. I used to be.
Yeah.
I have, a small presence in some places, but
yeah.
I don't actively engage in that technology, not because I don't have a lot of friends around the world that I want to talk to and see and keep up with. Of course I do.
Yeah.
But I go to the extra work of trying to do it, directly one-on-one or in very specific groups, rather than letting it be intermediated by the platform, because maybe only like 80% of what 20 to 30% of what I was seeing was actually the people I was there to see. A lot of it was other stuff. It was consuming a lot of time and energy and bringing a lot of angst.
Oh yeah.
And anger to conversations that like in between people that I like would never have talked about that topic with that person. And even if I had, and we had been face to face and having that conversation over a bite or a beer or something like that, would have gone very differently than it was going over the social media platform in this very like public forum.
Yeah.
So, 8 years or so ago, I just decided, okay, this isn't helping me. I definitely tried it, but I got to a point where I was like, this is not making my relationships better. So I'm just not going to do it. I'm going to use it purposefully when it's appropriate. When I have something that's useful for other people to know, then I'm going to put it out there. But if it's just about maintaining my relationships, then the inclusion of this technology is not adding value to my life.
Yeah.
And there are lots of technologies for where, like it's great that I have that option with social media, but there are other technologies for which I don't have that option. The internet, writing as sort of the two sort of case studies here, but
Yeah.
like there's so like we are so surrounded by technology in so many different places. There are a lot of people who will not want to use AI tools and don't realize that they're already subject to a lot of AI tools. Like the writing that other people are sending them is sometimes written by a large language model,
Oh yeah.
or that the recommendation engine that's putting ads in front of them is, highly AI driven. So for me, this is one of those things where, as presented in the story, there's this, you can completely opt out or you can, fully opt in, but you kind of can't do both. Like the two characters are sort of giving you the examples of where you can go because these technologies are so ubiquitous. Your ability to opt out might be limited,
Right.
and that doesn't sit well with me. Because I think like consent matters, right? Like my willingness to enjoy my life and experience my life in the way that I want to experience it. Like there should be some amount of active choice or volition in that. And if technology takes a role in our society, technology broadly can take that place in society where we're just subject to it like the weather, then like, I don't know, I feel like something's been taken away.
Well, yeah. I mean, this is why I go back to saying like we just have to try to recognize the water that we're swimming in. And this like this phrase, this idea of like it's the joke about the fish. It's like these like fish are swimming by. There's these two fish swimming, and they swim by this other fish, and the other fish goes, "Hey boys, how's the water today?" And they swim on, and the one fish is like, "What's water?" Like, and like
I like that.
we don't,
Yeah.
we live in it. And
Right.
what I would say is like, look, you didn't ask to speak English. You were
Yeah.
born into an English speaking family.
Right.
I was born into Mormonism and speaking English. Like, there's a lot of technology that you do inherit. It's foisted on you. I think I had this conversation with my dad, at some point where he would always watch the local news at night.
Mm-hmm.
I was like, Dad, like that is garbage. Like you should not be watching that. Like the news is just like they just try to get you hooked to sell advertising. And he's like, what? Like he really had no idea. He's a smart guy. But he grew up in an era where like with Walter Cronkite and stuff like that, like he really saw news media as being like an institution that was like credible.
Right.
And he anyway, so like when I explained to him, I'm like, no, like it's like all for-profit media now that like has an agenda. And it's mostly just to sell advertising and to like make people outraged because that sells advertising. And he's like, that's crazy. And then of course he didn't like trust me. I mean, he did, but like he asked another friend who like worked in media and he's like, oh yeah, that's true. And I'm like, okay, so you just have to understand that. And so I think like your approach to social media is really good. I was thinking about this when you were talking about lead pipes and us sort of not understanding the implications of what we're doing, is that social media can be fine for a lot of people. But it's absolutely ruinous for people and like young people who are like, I am worthless if people don't like my post on Instagram, like where they really buy into the medium and they don't understand what it's doing to them and that it's shaping their priorities and like what matters in the world.
Right.
So yeah, we just kind of have to recognize the water that we're swimming in. It's an obligation I think we have.
Yeah. And so, I mean, taking it on that broader perspective of like, okay, we're at another pivotal moment, which I think is the reason that Ted Chiang wrote this story in the first place, is that we're at another pivotal moment where a lot of different technologies are being introduced.
Yeah.
It's not just the internet. It's not just cell phones. It's not just social media. It's not just AI.
Yeah.
It's CRISPR and biotechnology, right? It's clean energy. It's nuclear fusion. It's rockets into space. It's like we're at another sort of, potential technological explosion that can reorient the way in which we approach all kinds of problems.
Yeah.
Right? And I think for me, the takeaway from that story is: do we want to be that black and white about adopting it or not adopting it? Because there's going to be some sort of trade-off here that we're not going to see until it's already become a problem.
Yeah.
Right.
No, you're right. It's like we're somewhere in the middle.
Maybe it is all the way one way or the other. Maybe there is just maybe there is such a thing as a technology that is an unalloyed good, but like I have a hard time coming up with a list of more than 2 or 3. Like
we're talking about like fire, refrigeration.
Well, I mean, even like what was I reading this? I think I was reading this in Ray Naylor's book on The Mountain and the Sea.
Yeah.
he who invents, and he's quoting somebody, I don't remember who he's quoting, but he who invents the ship invents the shipwreck, right? He who invents electricity invents electrocution, right?
Yeah.
Like there is no version of introducing some sort of new capability that doesn't have a downside. The question is, how do you discover it? How do you limit it relative to the actual use of that technology?
Yeah.
And I think we just, the takeaway from this story is, for me, is that like we should talk to each other about more mature approaches to the adoption of all of these new technologies that we're bringing to bear, because we're not going to know the consequences until we're 5 or 6 years down the road, or maybe 10 or 15.
That's right.
And we might, if given the choice, go back and change some of those things. And you can't have this precautionary principle to say we're never going to go with any technology, because then you miss out on huge gains, right? Like things like figuring out that vaccines would never have happened if we were worried that there might be some negative consequence that we weren't aware of.
Right.
But like on the flip side of it, you can't, if you go completely open and just say, okay, all innovation all the time to all problems, forever, and anybody can do anything they want with them.
Right.
Like, then there'd be a lot of bad people with nuclear weapons in their backyards, right? Like we put limits on some things because there's reasons for doing so, right?
Yeah.
And I don't think we as a society have really good tools for thinking about that as a problem set.
I think you're right. Yeah. And I think one of the things the story does a good job of is showcasing why it's so hard to do as well. Like in the case of Jijinji learning the right language, he doesn't even understand what words are. He's like, what are you trying? Like,
right. Have you clustered yours and I have not? Right?
Yeah. Like, yeah. And like, I don't know anything about the Tiv language or whatever, but like clearly they did have words, because the Mosby was able to explain what they were, and they would use language to refer to concepts and things like that. But he just grew up speaking fluently, engaging with the world with the language that he was raised with, without ever having to think about what words were.
Mm-hmm.
It was just purely instrumental. And again, but he was using a technology without even realizing it. And we do it all the time.
Yeah.
And so, I think creating some sort of literacy, or just the ability to understand like how much our reality is mediated by things is useful.
Well, but it's never not been, right? Like even going back to your dad with Walter Cronkite, right?
Yeah.
Like Walter Cronkite was the mediator, right?
Absolutely.
And whereas now it's 100,000 far less professional people, doing it for $1.
Yeah.
Right. Like which of those two scenarios is better?
Right.
Like,
right.
It kind of depends on what problem the society is facing. And what I love about a Ted Chiang story is that he takes something that we're arguing about or thinking about at kind of a societal level, because these big scale stories, and talks about them from a very personal experience, right? There's one person or two people who are going through that particular change in reality.
Yeah.
Right. And because it's a personal narrative and it pulls you through, and like it's just so cleanly and elegantly and purposefully written, and it's so original, like you're just completely drawn into it. It gives you a perspective on this story that you wouldn't get if you were only thinking about it in terms of like, is this technology good or bad from a societal level, or good for my kids? It's like, no, you've got it's a wonderful way to explore a concept from somebody else's perspective, one that you can't attain on your own. Right.
Yeah.
So there's so many of those too. I mean, like the one that comes immediately after, in I think the most recent compilation of all of Ted Chiang's stories, is this book, Exhalation.
Right. That's what this is in.
This is in Exhalation. Yeah. But right after it is The Great Silence.
Okay, I have not read that one. Oh. Okay. All right. I got my homework.
It's like 6 pages, man.
Okay. Another one of the little ones.
And it's amazing.
Okay.
It's absolutely amazing. But it's again, it's that same like personal narrator telling you the story from a perspective that you hadn't considered, in order to illuminate an insight on the world that should have been obvious but wasn't.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and there's another, just while we're just talking about how great Ted Chiang is and why these stories are so good, is that, he'll talk about a technology like Remem. Another one that comes to mind are the prisms in The Anxiety is the Dizziness of Freedom. Do you know this one?
No.
Oh, all right.
Yeah.
All right, Keith.
You got me. You got me.
You will love it. But it's another novel technology that allows you to sort of communicate with a version of yourself in a parallel universe.
Oh, no,
right?
I do remember this one. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. Okay, this is like a tablet or something, and it has a little light that has to like align, and then you could like.
It's you turn it on, and it either turns red or blue.
Okay.
And so if you see it turn red, that means there's been a split in the universe or whatever where it was blue.
Got
and
it.
then and then you have a means of communicating with the blue version.
I'd forgotten the title.
The version of you that's on the
I remember that.
blue side.
And so people can explore essentially alternate outcomes to their lives by talking to themselves through this. Yeah. Oh yeah, that was a good one too.
But what he does, and I mean, you said it quite well. We'll just say it sort of in slightly different ways. That like he uses these stories of novel technologies, or just examining how we engage with technology, really to just reveal what it is like to be a human, and like, and how we perceive of ourselves. Like there's a real core, I think, at the heart of his work that is really just an examination of like, at our core, what is it to be human, and how we're moving through this world. It's great.
Yeah.
Okay. Is there anything else you want to talk about? Fatherhood, raising kids in this world.
Well, okay. I have one sort of very short question for you.
Oh, okay.
Then let's wrap up. But are there technologies? I mean, you strike me being a technology oriented guy, familiar with lots of different kinds of technologies and using just about anyone that's, available for the sake of convenience. I think is what you told me once upon a time, that you'll use any technology if it provides a bit of convenience.
I will not. Okay, I will go on.
You will correct that statement?
Yeah, I'll correct that statement. Yeah.
All right. Well, not like I have a perfect episodic memory either, so I could be misremembering things.
Yeah, well,
I don't have a life log to show you of that conversation. But are there technologies that, like, when it comes to your kids adopting technologies, that you're like super cautious about, and that you're you're less interested in seeing put to use?
We're careful with games. I mean, the kids play games and stuff like that, and which we're happy to let them do, to stop bugging us all the time. And I confess to not being, letting parenting through screens occasionally. But we're like, look, no ad-based games. So if it's like a free game that's like advertising driven, we try to stave them off of that. Our son got really into a game called Brawl Stars, which like some of his other friends were playing. It's just kind of like a battle game. Okay. It's a sort of a strategy game where you've got a character that's got weapons and you go. It's like a battle royale thing.
Okay.
Kind of like a junior version of Fortnite or something like that.
Okay.
But there are game dynamics in it with like booster packs and bonus things, and you'd have to like log in every day, and then you get like your bonus thing for logging in. Right. And it was so clearly designed to be addictive, and he was clearly becoming addicted. We're like, this game, you can't play this game anymore, So I'm very mindful of, there's absolutely a huge multi-billion-dollar industry that has laser focus on getting kids addicted to gambling. It's effectively gambling, and they're doing it through cool games,
Right.
So I'm very worried about that stuff. I think what you might be, if I had my life log, would bring it up, but like, it's a theory I've had about Amazon as a business, that it's banking on the fact that people will not go back to being inconvenienced if they've ever been convenienced. So like
people buy into Amazon, but they never delete the account.
That's right. Or it's like, as soon as you get used to like Prime or whatever, like you don't want to go back to thinking about shipping costs and this and that. The Amazon Go store, which I don't know if they still exist, but the idea that like you could walk in and you just walk out without going through a cash register.
They had that at the ballpark for a while.
Yeah. So like they were always sort of banking on that sort of stuff. I mean, AWS, it's a huge part of AWS's business, is that like, if you used to manage like your own server and stuff like that, and you're like, oh my gosh, I can just like turn on a server and not think about it and shut it down. That's extremely convenient for somebody in that role. And so the entire business is based on the idea of lulling people into adoption through convenience. I actually like violently reject that. Like obviously I've been into computers my whole life, but like I hate most apps. I mean, the idea, like, we're always trying to like figure out like a way, and really we buy any appliance we've bought in the past few years, it has like this fridge is connected to the internet. I'm like, I do not want that fridge. Right. Like,
Right.
I want,
but you're getting to a point where you can't opt out, right? Like there will be a point where there are no fridges for sale that don't have one.
Yeah,
That don't have a
and
Wi-Fi card.
they'll figure out
and
a
it
way.
won't work.
That's
if you don't connect it to the internet, and it'll stop working if you disconnect it.
That's what I'm worried about. And yeah, it's already there, like with TVs, right? You can get these super cheap TVs that are internet enabled. We've had TVs that connect to the internet. We never connect the TV to the internet. Like we're an Apple family, and so we have an Apple TV, and like that's what we use as our set top box. But like we'll never connect the TV itself to the internet because I don't trust LG or
random manufacturer Y.
Yeah, TV. I'm like, I just don't know why I would do that, and so I'm very leery of all that kind of stuff. And especially, I mean, and the other issue is just, somebody said this. It's a pretty good line. I mean, there's the line that's, if the product is free, you are the product.
You are the product. Yeah.
There's another one. It's like, there's no Internet of Things. It's just other people's computer in your house, which I like. So yeah, I'm very leery of like subscription services and things that are sort of designed to get you hooked.
I had a subscription service. I actually had to change the credit card number. I had to cancel my card and get a whole new number because there was no way for me to cancel the subscription once they started it.
Wow.
And it was through a reputable service and a third company, but it was this company selling on a platform, and then the platform, through that platform, charging my card. And they said, and I go to them and I say, stop charging my card. I've tried to cancel this. And they said, well, you have to talk to the company. I went to the company and they're like, oh yeah, we'll stop it. And then they would do nothing about it. And it was a company somewhere in Korea or something like that. And they're like, oh yeah, we'll take care of it. And then it never, and this went on for like years.
Yeah.
And it wasn't enough money for me to care about it. Like it was pennies.
Yeah.
It was still like, I had no way of extracting them from my life without cutting off everybody else who was using that card.
Wow.
Right.
Yeah.
And like, that's where I think like, maybe there is a principle in technology adoption where like we go past this idea where somebody consents once to something and then is forever consenting to whatever it is the company's going to do with your data or going to do with your money or going to do with your, time and attention.
Yeah.
As it were. Right. Like maybe there's like, they periodically have to check in with us around user agreements to like, update their software. They're going to give us a new version of the software and their laws are going to change and they've been sued. So they change the user agreement and then we have to agree to that.
Yeah.
But it doesn't work the other way for us. We don't periodically get to like go in and check with them and say like, I don't consent to you doing this anymore.
Interesting.
With my stuff. I'd like my data back. There's no like regular check-in. You can do it if you're willing to do the work.
Right.
But it's a much bigger barrier for you than it is for them.
That's right. And this goes back to the whole conveniencing thing. They're like, if they got you once, then you're just hooked. They just assume you're hooked. If only there were a Consumer Financial Protection Bureau that could like, go to bat for people like this. If only. No, I mean, this is something you've heard me mention and I think is really important. I want to talk about a lot more through work and advocate for is this vague vision I have for cooperative SaaS, which is like, there's a lot of software as a service that I'm like, the internet is really architected nicely that like, it should allow the creation of consumer owned internet services. And so like Proton Mail is one of these things. I don't use it, but they're like based out of Switzerland, but where it's like, you don't need Gmail. You don't need the free product. You can pay. And if enough people use it, it should be pretty cheap to maintain a very secure, durable service that does give you affordances for governance or for you as an owner, it's a consumer owned cooperative where you as a consumer who is paid into it should have some say, with the understanding that like 99% of people just want an email server that works and they don't have strong opinions, just as long as you're not gouging them.
That they know of.
Yeah. Well,
or exploiting them in some way that they don't know of, right?
That's right. Well, that's the issue is that like, it can even be like a little gougy. Like let's use the example of Proton Mail where they're like, we figured out we can make 15% margins if we charge everybody $5 a month for email. If we have 100,000 users, I just did this. Who knows what the math works out. And then something miraculous happens. And they scale to 10 million users and they're still charging $5 a month. And so they're making 95% margins. Does anybody care that much? Like, it's $5 a month. It's fine. And as long as people are like fine, they're like, look, there's this sort of interesting thing in economics with pricing, which is like there's the actual sort of like market pressure that changes prices, but then there's also just kind of like a price that people don't care that much about. So they're like, it's $5 a month that I don't really care. That would be fine as long as they're not, to use the term, in shitifying in other ways and like using their data and reselling their data and doing other crazy stuff,
Right.
you know? So it's like, I'd gladly let a SaaS platform make a good amount of money and make really good margins, as long as I was confident that they weren't going to start doing weird stuff with my data, or spamming me or whatever it is.
Yeah.
So, I don't know.
Yeah. If only there were, people who were telling them what they were and were not allowed to do with such tremendous power and access to everyone's information.
Yes. Well, here we are. It's a brave new world. Anyway, well, yeah, we can talk about voting also as a technology.
Actually, that's one you should have a completely separate podcast about, because there's a ton of really, I think, that voting and elections in many ways are technologies of the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries.
Oh, yeah.
Right? And we've got much better tools for understanding and connecting to the will and the interests of a population that just didn't exist and couldn't have been conceptualized by James Madison or Alexander Hamilton or any of the others. The way in which we delegate certain kinds of authority and the way in which we arrive at certain sorts of social decisions. There's a lot of innovation going on around the world in places that are new democracies that don't have this long history and the burden of that long history. And when it comes to how to solve some of these problems that have tremendous innovations out there, that's an investigation topic all of its own.
Oh yeah,
just like, and I think coming back to this, the story here, like when your perspective on what the right thing to do is the individual, and particularly an individual who's swimming in a particular set of water, as you put it, you're only going to see a certain possibility space.
Right.
But if you take yourself out of that fish out of water and you can see that there are animals that breathe air, just to take the analogy a little too far, you can start to understand that there are other ways to solve the same kind of problem. And I think there are a lot of really interesting conversations about how you translate, local community interest in decisions about, any number of things that governments make decisions about. That should be much more closely representative of what people want and directly connected to what they want, and helping them to connect an understanding of, like we were talking about before, what's going on in their society to what their decisions they're making about that. I mean, voting is a technology.
That's right.
Right.
Yeah.
And,
produces
a pretty darn important one. Right?
Yeah.
Like, so anyway, anything else?
No, this is awesome. I mean, obviously we could just keep going.
We could
forever,
keep going.
So
we could keep going. But then there's this other technology called traffic.
Exactly.
Or shall we say spillover of technology, or an externality of technology?
Yeah. Something like that. But yeah, we got to beat the traffic.
Got to beat the traffic.
Thank you so much for coming out and doing this.
Thanks for having me. It's a great conversation.
I will ask you to come on again someday. All right. I hope you enjoyed that. I certainly did. I love this story. I've read it a bunch. It keeps paying off. We talked for a long time. I still don't think we covered barely. I mean, there's just still so much more to discuss. So many jumping off points to so many conversations about how we understand the world and how difficult it is for us to see through the technologies and concepts that mediate our reality. Anyway, the story pays off so much, and I just want to thank Keith again for coming on and having this conversation. Also, thanks again to the Allen Institute for AI for giving us office space so that we could record. Really nice of them. Just lovely, lovely people doing incredible work, and lucky to live in the same town. So see you next month. We will be, I've already recorded the episode with George Dyson. We'll be talking about Childhood's End by Arthur C. Clarke, and it's another doozy. And so look forward to that next month. Thanks for listening. Thanks as always to Secret School for creating the intro music for Text on Text. Thanks to We for letting us use their song 3/10 of the Population for this outro music. And as always, tell a friend if you like the podcast. Subscribe to the podcast if you haven't already. You can like us on YouTube. Also, we're on LinkedIn now. There's a LinkedIn page for Techs on Tech, so you can follow that. We're on Blue Sky. I'm really bad at all the social stuff. I just don't prioritize it enough. But, it doesn't hurt to follow us on those things, and I'll try to keep people updated on things through those channels. And as always, if you want to support the podcast, just drop me a line. Let me know. We're always looking for help. So thanks so much for listening, and see you in a month.